everyone. Welcome to Enjoying the Sake of Western Honshu. Thank you for joining us. My name is Megumi. I'm your host today. In light of the current circumstances due to the COVID-19, we've decided to have this lecture online. We hope you all at home enjoy the wonder of sake and pairing food. First of all, the organizer of this event, Mr. Yusaku Shimizu from the Hiroshima Regional Taxation Bureau, will give us an opening speech.
Welcome to Enjoying the Sake of Western Honshu. In Western Honshu, whose population is about 5% of the national population, we have more than 200 sake breweries, which accounts for more than 10% of the total number of sake breweries in Japan. That is, Western Honshu area is a highly competitive sake market. Today, the distinguished sake expert, Mr. Gontona, selected 5 breweries. We hope all of you enjoy the lectures and miracle combination of the selected sake and food, and share your findings in this seminar with your drinking community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, I'd like to introduce today's lecturer, Mr. John Gartner, to everyone. He is recognized as the world's leading non-Japanese sake expert. Mr. John Gartner was born in Cleveland, Ohio. In 1988, he came to Japan as a teacher for the JET program. After a while, he became a sake journalist and wrote the Nihonshu column in the Japan Times for 8 years. From 2003, he started to organize seminars to promote Japanese sake. He is a member of the Japanese Sake Export Association, SEA, and devoted himself to exporting Japanese sake. Known as the sake guy, he appeared in the movie or TV show for many times. And also he is an author of 4 books on sake, such as 日本人も知らない日本酒の話, that story of sake that even Japanese people don't know, 日本のsake, Japanese sake, the Sake Handbook, and Sake Confidential. All right, now let me ask you to join me in giving a big hand to Mr. John Gartner.
Good afternoon, and thank you for that warm introduction, and welcome everyone to the presentation on the sake of Western Honshu. Thanks also to the Hiroshima Regional Taxation Bureau for organizing all of this. It's going to be a wonderful event, I'm sure. I've heard there's people from all over the world, people from 30 different countries that are tuning in to the presentation today. Unfortunately, we can only get sake to those people living in Japan, but I hope everyone outside of Japan enjoys the presentation as well. A little bit about how things will flow today. We'll have 2 parts to the presentation. The first part will last about 40 minutes, maybe a little bit longer. And what I'll cover in the first half is everything you need to know about sake to enjoy it today. Kind of a sake quick start guide. After that, we'll talk about the basics of sake, the regionality in the sake world, and how that applies. We'll talk a bit about sake and food in a nutshell, and that will wrap up the first part of the presentation. We'll then take a 5-minute break. And during that 5-minute break, please prepare the sake and any food that you have to enjoy with the sake. Furthermore, if your sake is in the refrigerator now, you might want to pull it out to let it warm up a little bit to be a bit more enjoyable when we actually do get around to tasting it. So we will move on to part 2 then. And in part 2, we'll have a regional tasting again of 5 sake with food. And we will intersperse those tastings with some information on the sake industry layout. And we'll know what that means when I get there. And we'll have 1 sake from each of the 5 prefectures that are under the jurisdiction of the Hiroshima Tax Bureau. We'll talk a little about each sake and prefecture from which it comes, a bit about the food and the pairing, and then we'll have some lively banter with Mr. Andy Russell, who will be introduced as we get into the second part. Next, before diving into the material, I believe everyone should have some materials that were sent along to the participants. And I just wanted to say a bit about the materials that you have. The first page is the most important one. That's the list of the sake that we'll be tasting for those of you that are in Japan, and a little bit about each one of those sake. The next page is just an outline of my presentation, and you really don't need to pay attention to that if you're watching this, the slideshow. Furthermore, I do have a map of Japan that will show you a bit about the regions. You might want to refer to that map when we talk about the prefectures in Western Honshu. Then I've got a couple of diagrams to which I'll be referring, and a write-up on the sake regionality and sake and food. And again, this material will be in the presentation, but just as a souvenir, I've included it in this handout. And lastly, I've got a basic flavor profile description of all the basic types of sake. And again, I'll refer to that as we go through the presentation, but I thought it might be nice for everybody to have that as well. So with that having been said, I'd like to move on and jump right in because we don't have a ton of time today. There's a lot to be said and not nearly as much time as I would like, so we'll move into the presentation. Again, what I want to cover in this first part is the basics of sake, the pillars, the main things you need to know to go out and enjoy sake today. So yeah, this is a bit of an oversimplified presentation, but my goal is for you to be able to go out tonight, wherever you are, and go to a retail shop and bring home a bottle of sake, or go to a restaurant and order sake with confidence and enjoy it. That's what this whole first presentation is geared toward. And when we do that, we have to begin by asking the most important question: what is it? What is this stuff that we call sake? And in short, it's an alcoholic beverage that's brewed, and it's brewed from rice and rice alone. And I want to talk about these things one at a time. So it's an alcoholic beverage that's brewed, and it's brewed from rice and rice alone. Sake is actually unique in the way that it's produced, but it's closer to a beer than it is to anything else. In other words, it's not a wine, it's not a spirit, it's actually closer to a beer than it is to anything else, but it is unique, and we'll talk about what makes it unique in a moment. As I mentioned, it's not a simple fermentation, and it's not a distilled beverage. When talking about alcoholic beverages, we need to start to talk about yeast first. Yeast is crucial to every alcoholic beverage, and what yeast does is it takes in sugar and gives us carbon dioxide and alcohol. And that's what yeast does. Yeast takes in sugar and gives us carbon dioxide and alcohol. So before we talk about what sake is, let's talk a bit about what sake is not. Sometimes we hear sake referred to as a rice wine, and that's actually a misnomer, because sake is not a wine. If you look at how wine is made from grape juice. And there's sugar already in the grape juice. And that's all the yeast needs to give us carbon dioxide and alcohol. So you have grape juice, you pitch the yeast into that, and because there's sugar in the grape juice, the yeast will take that and convert it into carbon dioxide and alcohol. That's what's called a simple fermentation, and sake is not made like that. The other thing that sake is not a distilled beverage. If you look at how a distilled beverage is made, you take something that's fermented or brewed, and oversimplifying, you boil it. And what happens is, because water and alcohol will recondense into liquids at different temperatures, you can pull the water off and put the alcohol back into the mixture. And that's an oversimplification of the distillation process, and sake is not a distilled beverage. So beer and sake are both made from grains. Beer is made from barley, and sake is made from rice. In grains, there's no sugar. There's only starch. You could throw all the yeast in the world into a tank of rice or a tank of barley, and you're not going to get any alcohol because the yeast cells can't process the starch molecules. So when we make beer, what we do is we take the barley and we malt it. And what that means is we moisten it, we warm it, and it sprouts. When that happens, enzymes come out of the cells in the barley. These enzymes are key. At very specific temperatures, the enzymes will chop the starch into sugar. Now we have sugar. Now you can put your yeast in that and ferment that to get alcohol and carbon dioxide. So that's the way that beer is made. When we make sake, however, we need to get enzymes, but we can't malt the rice in the same way that we malted the barley. Why not? Because there's no husks. We've ground away, we've milled away, we've polished away the outside of the rice grains, so there's no husks. And as such, we cannot source the enzymes the same way that we do when we make beer. But we still need enzymes somewhere. So what we do when making sake is we use a mold, and that mold will give us the enzymes that we need. That mold is known as Aspergillus oryzae in the scientific world. In Japanese, it's called koji mold or koji-kin. And what they do is they sprinkle that mold on about 20 to 25% of all the rice that goes into a batch of sake. As this mold grows onto and into the rice, it gives us the enzymes that we need that will then later be used to convert starch into sugar, allowing us to ferment that. So the completed moldy rice is known as koji. Koji is not a mold. The completed rice, moldy rice, is known as koji. And koji is really, really the heart of the sake brewing process. Enzymes from the koji will convert starch in the rice into sugar, but koji does so much more. It gives us amino acids and flavors and all kinds of things as well. Really, it is the heart of the brewing process. Although its main role is to give us enzymes that'll chop the starch in the rice into sugar. Again, a bit more about beer and sake, and we'll move on from the technical aspects of this presentation fairly soon. But when you make beer, it's interesting that starch to sugar conversion and sugar to alcohol fermentation are sequential and separate steps when you make beer. In other words, when you make beer, you do all of your starch to sugar conversion first. Then you do your sugar to alcohol fermentation. However, when you make sake, you've got this moldy rice called koji in the same tank at the same time as the yeast is. And the koji slowly converts starch to sugar, and the yeast slowly converts that sugar to alcohol and carbon dioxide. So in sake, starch to sugar conversion and sugar to alcohol fermentation take place at the same time in the same tank. Sake is the only beverage on the planet where that actually occurs. And it's very, very special. It allows us to get much higher alcohol content and makes the brewing process much more complicated and unique. And again, starch to sugar conversion and sugar to alcohol fermentation take place at the same time in the same tank. Next, another thing about sake, as I mentioned now, it's a brewed beverage, unique but closer to a beer than anything else. But rice is the only fermentable material used in the production of sake. For example, when you make beer, they might use other things like wheat or other adjuncts as well. But when they're making sake, rice is the only fermentable product that they actually use in production. So sake is an alcoholic beverage that's brewed, and it's brewed from rice and rice alone. The alcohol content is usually about 16%. It could be 14, it could be 18, but usually it's just about 16%. Naturally, the alcohol content can get as high as 20%, but they almost always water that down or taper fermentation to leave it about 16%, simply because the flavors and aromas are much more enjoyable at that slightly lower alcohol content. Next, the history of sake. How long has sake been around? There's a long answer and a short answer to everything related to sake. And the short answer about how long sake's been around is about 1,000 years. The reason I say that is there's many steps of the sake brewing process. And they've been making sake for more or less the same way, utilizing the same steps for about the last 1,000 years. Maybe 800, maybe 1,200, but about the last 1,000 years, they've been making sake using all of the steps of the process that they use today. So the short answer, sake's been around for about 1,000 years. However, in some way, shape, or form, they've been drinking an alcoholic beverage made from rice in Japan for about 1,700 to 2,000 years. Archaeological finds have shown that someone left some steamed rice laying around in a bowl, and some naturally occurring koji mold fell into that, and then some naturally occurring yeast fells in there. And then about 2 weeks later, there was a oatmeal-like mash, and when people ate that, it made them smile, it made them happy. And they very, very carefully tried to reproduce that. And over the years, they got much more refined product and much more higher alcohol content as well. But in some way, shape, or form, they've been drinking an alcoholic beverage made from rice in Japan for about 1,700 to 2,000 years. However, a further complication to the history question is what's known as ginjo. Ginjo is super premium sake. We'll talk more about that, and we'll taste it today as well. But ginjo's only been around as a viable product on the market for like 40 to 50 years. I mean, ginjo gets all the spotlight these days. It's ginjo this and ginjo that, and it's great. But it's really only been a part of the sake market for about the last 40 or 50 years. So again, the short answer to the history of sake is about 1,000 years, but the more complicated answer is a little bit longer. Next, I want to talk about good sake and better sake. And before I go into that, though, what makes one sake more enjoyable than another, there's a really great rule of thumb about sake that I'd like to convey. And again, remember, my goal is for you to go out and enjoy sake today or tonight. And in order to do that, one of the simplest rules you can remember is this, is that sake is fairly priced 90% of the time. So if you can walk into a restaurant and look at a menu or a retailer that sells sake, you don't have to be able to read the labels, you don't have to know the grades. If you made a decision on price and price alone, 90% of the time, you would be happy with your choice. Of course, once your particular preferences are brought into this equation, then this no longer makes too much sense. In other words, if you know you like dry sake and a particular sweeter sake is more expensive, by all means, get the dry one because you know you like that better. But if you had nothing else to base your decision on, If you made a decision based on price and price alone, you'd be happy with your decision 90% of the time. So what I want to talk about now is what affects this parallel line of price and quality. What makes one sake inexpensive and okay, and another sake fairly expensive and really enjoyable? And the way I like to word it is there's three things. There's three things that make one sake better and more expensive than another. The first of those three things is the quality of the rice that you begin with. The second of those two things is how much you've milled that rice before you begin to brew. And the third of those three things is the craftsmanship, the labor intensiveness that went into the brewing process. And I want to talk about these things one at a time right now. First of all, sake rice. Sake rice is different from table rice, from eating rice, and there's a number of differences. I have to quickly add that not all sake is made from sake rice. It is not required to use proper sake rice to make sake. In fact, most sake is actually not made using proper sake rice. But when you get into the realm of premium sake, most of the time it's going to be made with proper sake rice. And there's a number of differences between sake rice and table rice. First of all, the plant itself is much taller. Sake rice is much taller. The grains themselves are visibly larger. We can see that with the naked eye. So sake rice is actually larger. It's much more difficult to grow, and it's much more particular about climate for that reason. Also, sake rice has more starch in it than regular eating rice. Now remember, starch gets converted into sugar, and that gets converted into alcohol. So we like starch, and sake rice has more starch in it than regular table rice. Furthermore, sake rice actually has less fat and protein in it than regular table rice. Now that fat and protein makes table rice taste better. However, when you ferment that, the proteins and fats can lead to off flavors, to rougher flavors. So sake rice has more starch and less fat and protein in it than regular table rice. Furthermore, the starches that we want so badly in sake rice are actually physically located in the center of the grain. In other words, we can see that right here. If you look at a lot of the rice in this picture, you can see an opaque center to the grains and more of a translucent part around that. The starches are physically concentrated in the center of the grain in sake rice. What's so good about this is it allows us to mill the outside of the grains away, and we take away the fat and protein, and we leave only the starch behind. One more thing about sake rice is it's much more expensive than regular table rice. As such, by using proper sake rice, you're going to drive the price of the sake up, but it will be much more worth it to make it with sake rice in terms of flavors and aromas. So the first thing that makes one sake better and more expensive than another is the quality of the rice that you begin with. The second thing that makes one sake better and more expensive than another is milling. Remember, what we want to do is we want to mill the rice more and more to take away fat and protein and leave only the starch behind. So what you do to make better and better sake, to more technically better sake, you mill and mill more and more of the outside of the rice, and you remove the fat and protein and leave only the starch behind. As you can imagine, though, if you take sake rice, which is already significantly more expensive than table rice, and you mill away the outer 30%, 40%, 50%, 60% of your raw materials before you even begin to brew, you're going to drive your price through the roof, aren't you? Yes, you are. Is it worth it? Yes, it is. Making sake with highly milled, proper sake rice will give you a much more elegant product, a much more refined product, but a significantly more expensive product as well. Very often we talk about milling, and these people want to know, well, how do they mill the rice? How do they grind away the outside? And they have very advanced machines like this that do that. If you look at these machines, you can put about 1 to 2 tons of rice in that conical shaped hopper. And what happens is the rice drops down onto a spinning grinding stone, and a little bit gets nicked off. And then it goes back into the hopper, and it goes around and around and around for hours and sometimes days. And each time it goes around, a little bit more is milled off. And eventually, you can mill away enough of the rice to make the higher grades of sake. So that's what the actual milling machine looks like. Milling is so important that the various grades of sake are defined by nothing legally more significant than how much the rice was milled. The various grades of premium sake are defined by how much the rice was milled before you begin to brew. That's how important and significant the concept of milling is. The term for the milling rate, the term for how much sake has been milled, is known as the seimai buai in Japanese. But what I really want to convey is the number that they give you, the percentage that they give you, is what remains after milling. So in other words, if something has a 60% seimai buai, that means they milled it down to take away the outer 40% and leave only the 60% behind. It tells you what remains. It's counterintuitive sometimes, but you might want to remember that as you look at labels of sake from here on. So the first thing that makes one sake better and more expensive than another is the quality of the rice that you begin with. The second thing that makes one sake better and more expensive than another is how much you've milled the rice before you begin to brew. The third thing that makes one sake better and more expensive than another is craftsmanship. And what I mean by that is you can make sake using very automated processes. And probably most of the sake in Japan is made using machines, very automated processes. And a lot of that sake is perfectly enjoyable. There's nothing wrong with machines. They make great sake. However, when you get into the realms of premium sake, every single step of the process will be done by hand. And every single step of the process done by hand will add a little bit more quality that cascades with each step. So when you want to make the best sake possible, you have to do every single step of the process by hand. It's better, in the opinion of most people, to do every single step of the process by hand, and that will give you a significantly better sake. But of course, to do that calls for a lot more labor, a lot more craftsmanship, and that will drive your price up as well. So those are the three things that make one sake better and more expensive than another. The quality of the rice that you begin with, the milling that you do to the rice before you begin to brew, and the hand-laden craftsmanship that goes into the brewing process. The next thing I'd like to talk about is the grades of sake. If you were to look in the manual or the material that's been distributed for those of you that have it, you'll probably see you will see a pyramid like this. It'll actually be on the third page. And this is everything you need to know about the grades of sake crammed into one diagram here. I'm really proud of this. I thought it was great. They got everything fit into one diagram, and then I realized it's actually not that easy to read for most people. So I've made a very similar, much less interesting, same information version of this. It's a bit easier to read. As I go through the next few slides, you want to refer to either the pyramid or the square chart as I talk about the various grades of sake. Before diving into too much detail, and I really won't go into too much detail today, however, if you look at the pyramid or the square chart, there's a couple of principles that I think will help you to understand the grades of sake. The higher you go on the chart, the higher you're going in technical quality. Now you'll notice I've italicized the word technical quality. That doesn't mean it's the only thing you want to drink. It doesn't mean the grades at the top of the pyramid are the only things that you want to drink. By all means, drink all kinds of sake, enjoy all kinds of sake. But when I talk about technical quality, what I mean by that is the higher you go in the pyramid, the more difficult it is to make those sake technically. It calls for a lot more effort, a lot more skill, a lot more intuition, and a lot more experience. So the higher grades at the top of the pyramid of the chart are going to be much more difficult to make, and technically, they're of a higher quality. Furthermore, the higher you go on the chart, the more refined and delicate and aromatic the sake tends to be. So if we look at the top grades of Junmai Daiginjo and Daiginjo, they tend to be much more aromatic, much more light, and much more refined than the grades in the lower parts of the pyramid or the square chart. Furthermore, because sake is fairly priced 90% of the time, the higher you go in the pyramid on the chart, the more expensive the sake is going to be. And again, I don't want to pick on Daiginjo and Junmai Daiginjo, but they will be typically the most expensive sake on the market when you're out shopping. Furthermore, I mentioned before how important the milling of the rice is, and that the legal grades of sake are defined by nothing more significant than how much the rice was milled before we began to brew. And the various grades of sake here, the higher you go in the pyramid or on the square chart, the more you need to mill the rice to legally qualify for those grades of sake. So these are the things that I want you to remember as you look at the pyramid or the rectangular chart. If you were to remember one word about the grades of sake today, let that word be ginjo. Ginjo is super premium sake. The four types of ginjo, collectively known as ginjoshu, will be about 15% of all the sake on the market. If you drink something with the word ginjo embedded on the label somewhere, you're drinking the top 15% of sake. So really, I'm talking again technically. The best grades of sake, if you remember one word, let that word be ginjo, and you'll always be drinking the technically best grades of sake. So start there. If you want to go out today and experience sake, and you haven't had a lot of sake to date, drink something with the word ginjo on the label, and you can be sure you'll have an enjoyable experience. So start there, but don't stop there. By all means, drink all grades of sake. Drink as many different types of sake as you can. Ginjo is great, but it's not the only style of sake out there. So start there, but please don't stop there. Continue to drink the other grades of sake as well. Very quickly, if I could talk about each of the grades just a quick moment to be fair to all of them. Again, you could follow along in the last page of the handout that I gave you, typical flavor manifestations for the various grades of sake. We look at futsushu, and futsushu literally means regular sake. And what futsushu is, it's basically sake that doesn't qualify for one of the other special terms. It is fairly run-of-the-mill sake. There's no definition on how much the rice has been milled. And although it isn't considered premium, there's a lot of really, really, really wonderful futsushu out there. So by all means, explore the futsushu world as well. It's actually about 60 to 65% of the entire sake market is futsushu. Moving up to the next level, we have something called Honjozo and something called Junmaishu. There's a couple of differences between these two. They're on the same level because originally they had the same milling requirements of 70%. If you look at Honjozo, it does have a milling requirement of 70%, and you're allowed to use a little bit of distilled alcohol in the brewing of Honjozo. I'll come back to that in a minute or two. Junmaishu, on the other hand, no longer has a milling requirement, but you need to make it with rice, water, and koji only. You're not allowed to add any alcohol to that. It tends to be fairly rich and often has a good acidity to it as well. Once we move up to the next level of Ginjo and Junmai Ginjo, now we're in a completely different world. The world of Ginjoshu, it has to be made differently, has a completely different level of refinement, and also a completely different level of aromatics as well. So on this level, we got something called Ginjo and Junmai Ginjo. The minimum milling rate, the minimum seimai buai, is 60% to qualify for these grades. Now you're getting into fruitier sake, lighter sake, more refined sake, and more elegant sake as well. The biggest difference between Ginjo and Junmai Ginjo is, again, the adding of the alcohol in the regular Ginjo and rice and water and koji only in the Junmai style. But flavor-wise, typically, the Junmai Ginjo types will typically be a little bit more rich than the added alcohol types. Is that a 100% solid rule? No, it isn't. But typically, they will be in that way. Then moving up to the top level, we've got something called Dai Ginjo and Junmai Dai Ginjo. Technically, the main difference is that Dai Ginjo has had a bit of distilled alcohol used in the brewing process, whereas Junmai Dai Ginjo is made with rice, water, and koji mold only. This is going to be much more aromatic sake, typically. Typically, it's going to be much more aromatic, much more refined, much more elegant sake than the grades that are below it. Furthermore, again, and it gets subtle here, but probably the big difference between Dai Ginjo and Junmai Dai Ginjo flavor-wise, typically speaking, is the Junmai style will be a little bit richer because they haven't added the alcohol to it. The next thing I want to point out about the grades on the pyramid is there's a lot of overlap between the various grades of sake on this pyramid. In other words, there's nobody in the world that can taste a sake and every single time tell you what grade it fits into. If you're a professional and do a lot of tasting, yeah, you can do it pretty often. But to taste a sake and every single time tell you exactly what grade it is, it's not going to happen. And the whole point is there's a whole lot of overlap between the flavors and aromatic profiles of the various grades of sake. As one example, typically Dai Ginjo and Junmai Dai Ginjo are very aromatic. But there's certain parts of Japan where they just don't like to make aromatic sake. And the Dai Ginjo from those parts of Japan will be very refined, very elegant, wonderful stuff, but won't be so heavily fruit-laden and won't be so aromatic. The other side of the coin is Junmaishu usually is fairly solid, fairly ricey in flavor, often with a good acidity, but usually doesn't have such fruity aromas. But once in a while, you do have a Junmaishu that does have some fruity aromas to it. So my point is there's a whole lot of overlap between the various grades of sake. And my final point to everyone is don't fall in love with or get married to one particular grade. In other words, don't say, I only drink Junmai Ginjo or I only drink Dai Ginjo. Make sure to drink as wide a range of sake as you can because there's so much overlap between the various grades of sake. Next, I'd like to say a bit about the use of added alcohol in premium sake. If you were to look at either the pyramid or the square chart, the grade called futsushu at the bottom is actually made using rice, water, koji, and copious amounts of distilled alcohol. And in the futsushu realm, when they make futsushu, they add the distilled alcohol to make it less expensively. And a lot of futsushu is really, really enjoyable. But the point is, when they add it at futsushu levels, they do it for economic reasons, to make the sake less expensively. And they're also they're allowed to add a good dollop, a good amount of alcohol at that level. By the way, they do add distilled alcohol to the process once brewing has been completed. However, it's not fortified because they'll add more water later to bring the alcohol back down to about 16%. So it's not a fortified beverage. Now, if you were to look in the top part of the pyramid, on the right side, going from the top down, you'll see Junmai Dai Ginjo, Junmai Ginjo, and Junmaishu. You'll notice the word Junmai is in each one of those, correct? That means pure rice. And what that means is the sake was made using rice, water, and koji only, no distilled alcohol. However, if you look on the left side, where from the top it says Dai Ginjo, Ginjo, and Honjozo, you notice that the Junmai word is conspicuously absent, isn't it? And what they've done is they've added a little bit of distilled alcohol to the process in making the non-junmai types of premium sake. However, what I want to convey and what I want to emphasize is in the premium levels of sake, in other words, in Honjozo, Ginjo, and Daiginjo, when they've added a bit of alcohol to it, they don't do it for economic reasons. They do it for very, very good technical reasons. And what are those technical reasons? There's a couple of them. The main two are, by adding a bit of alcohol to the fermenting mash right before the final filtration, you're able to crank out a bit more flavor and aroma. It's like a crowbar. You're able to, by temporarily raising the overall alcohol content, you're able to loosen flavors and aromas and extract more flavor and aroma from the fermenting mash by having used that added alcohol step. It's a very, very skillful, very, very good method. Furthermore, when you use a bit of alcohol in this way in making the sake, it's got a better shelf life. So my main point to everyone is, by using the added alcohol process, you're actually doing it for good technical reasons, and you're not doing it for economic reasons whatsoever. So please do remember that when you go out. Just to wrap this up, if you look at the top grades of sake, again, you have Junmai Daiginjo and Daiginjo. And Daiginjo is made using a little bit of added alcohol in the process, and they did that for a couple of reasons. One, to extract more aroma and flavor, and two, to improve on the shelf life. And with that, wrapping it up, we can move on a little bit from here. But again, the most important thing to learn in learning about sake is to try as wide a range of all sake grades as you can. Don't just drink one type. Drink as many different types of sake as you can. That's the best way to learn about sake. You don't need to watch interviews on YouTube. You don't need to read books and things like that. If you taste as wide a range of sake as possible, you're getting the best sake education that you possibly can. Next, I'd like to move on from technical stuff to some simpler things related to sake. The first of those would be aging. And I want to begin by saying most sake is not aged. 99.99999% of all sake is meant to be consumed relatively young. But there are delicious exceptions. Again, very little aged sake is in the market, but it can be extremely enjoyable. So in general, my main point is you don't want to buy sake and cellar it. You don't want to collect it. You don't want to age it yourself at home. Basically, brewers want you to drink the sake relatively soon after having purchased it. So yeah, there is some aged sake on the market, and it can be really enjoyable. But for the most part, you want to drink your sake soon after having purchased it and enjoy it relatively young. If you were to take it home and collect it and cellar it and age it, it would not increase in value at home. So it doesn't work like some other beverages might in that sense. Next, temperature. At what temperature should you enjoy your sake at? I mean, we see hot sake all over the place, and we may wonder if we buy something and bring it home, at what temperature should we enjoy it? And again, there's a long answer and a short answer to this as well. And the simplest short answer for you is to enjoy your ginjo, enjoy your premium, slightly chilled. What's slightly chilled? Like a white wine. Not too cold, not right out of the refrigerator, but closer to white wine temperature. However, there's some wonderful, wonderful, delicious exceptions. Be sure to experiment with temperature once you're comfortable doing so. I have to admit, the older I get, the more I love warm sake. I don't know if it's age or the fact that I've been drinking sake for so many years, but my preferences have tended towards warm sake as time goes on. So again, the simple rule is enjoy your premium ginjo slightly chilled. Just know that there are delicious exceptions, and you should experiment with them as soon as you're comfortable. A bit more about hot sake. Very often we will hear people that are selling sake on the street, or people talking about sake, saying that good sake you drink cold and bad sake you can drink hot, and that the only reason they heat sake is to hide the flaws. And folks, that's just not true. This is so far from the truth. They don't heat sake to hide the flaws at all. First of all, a really good sake is something you can enjoy at several temperatures for sure. So it's not simple. It's not as simple as good sake is cold, serve good sake cold and bad sake hot. Not at all. Furthermore, much premium sake is really, really enjoyable warmed, and nobody ever heated sake to hide the flaws. That's not why they do it. It might accomplish that, but that's not why they heat it. So this whole thing here that you might hear on the street from time to time is absolutely not true. Next, I'd like to move on to vessels. And again, To help you to enjoy sake today, one thing I like to say is that white wine glasses are a great choice for enjoying premium sake. White wine glasses are a great choice for enjoying ginjo. And what's really good about them is, number one, they do focus flavors and aromas quite nicely, but they're everywhere. Everybody's got them. The one thing I really don't want to happen is for someone to say, hey, I'd like to try some sake tonight, but we don't have the right glassware, so let's drink wine instead. We can't let that happen. And white wine glasses are everywhere, and they really are a great choice for premium sake. So I highly recommend white wine glasses, and that will allow you to enjoy sake, again, tonight at home or wherever you go. However, I do have to hasten to add that traditional Japanese pottery can really, really add a very, very enjoyable dimension to tasting sake as well. The visual and the tactile appeal of proper Japanese pottery can just really, really enhance the experience and make it much more enjoyable. So I enjoy using both, but I would recommend that you experiment with both as well. Having said all that, white wine glasses are typically not seen in restaurants in Japan. Sometimes. I'm seeing them more and more, but it's not as if they use them commonly in Japan. They actually don't, but I am seeing them more and more as time does pass. So white wine glasses are a great choice as well. How should you take care of your sake? In short, keep your sake cool and keep it out of strong light, and you'll be able to take care of your sake just fine. It is not necessary to keep your sake in the refrigerator, provided it has been pasteurized. If your sake is unpasteurized, which is known as nama sake, you need to keep that in the refrigerator, or else its chances of going bad, of getting weird, are very high. So if your sake is nama, if your sake is not pasteurized, keep that in the refrigerator. If your sake has been pasteurized, it's not absolutely necessary to keep it cold. It'll be fine for a couple of months probably before you'll notice any changes. Again, having said that, there's no simple answers to any questions in sake. Refrigeration will slow down maturation. So if you're not going to get to it right away and you have the room, the refrigerator is a perfectly good place to store your sake as well. In terms of storage, how long will an open bottle of sake last? So sake will suffer from the adverse effects of oxidation just like wine will. But sake is much more forgiving than a bottle of wine. In my mind, with a bottle of wine, you open it, you've got what, a day or two before it starts to lose its flavors and aromas? With sake, to me, any sake will last about a week. You open it, you have half the bottle, a couple of glasses. It's going to maintain its quality. It's going to maintain its pristine state. It's going to maintain the original flavors and aromas for at least a week. Some sake will last much longer than that. But I think any sake will last about a week once a bottle has been opened. But remember, the clock is ticking, right? It will oxidize, and you really do want to get to it as soon as possible. Just remember that it is a little bit more forgiving than a bottle of wine. Next, I want to talk about a couple other things about which I'm often asked. We have something called nigori sake, which is cloudy sake. That's exactly what the term means, nigori sake. And I'm sure we've seen it. It's very popular outside of Japan, and somewhat popular in Japan as well. But it's a white, cloudy sake. And a lot of people say that it's unfiltered sake and that the fermenting rice is left in the bottle. And that's actually not true. Nigori sake is cloudy, but it's not unfiltered sake. You legally must filter out the rice solids for it to be called sake. So when they make nigori sake, it is filtered, but it's actually filtered more coarsely. In other words, the filter has bigger holes to allow some of the rice solids to come through. Why do they do that? It's a throwback to the way sake was made 1,000 years ago. It can be really enjoyable, but remember, it's not totally unfiltered, it's just more coarsely filtered. Next, I'd like to move on and talk about sake and food a little bit. And again, this is a conversation that I could have for hours, and it still wouldn't do justice to the topic. But we need to kind of rein that in a little bit today. So I just want to give you a couple of things about it. So the first thing is that there's absolutely no reason to limit sake to Japanese food. Of course, sake and Japanese food go very, very well together. They were made to go together, quite literally. But sake is a very, very, very food-friendly beverage. It's probably the most food-friendly beverages on the planet. To me, rarely do you get a clash between sake and food. Now, of course, sake is a fairly light beverage, right? It doesn't have the footprint or the presence that wine does. And so a very strong, spicy food can drown out sake for sure. But I think if you look at food on a table, you can see where the really strong flavors are and that they will just crush a sake. Really spicy food, for example, or very rich, strong sauces will squash out a sake. But once you remove the obvious mismatches from the equation, sake is an extremely food-friendly beverage, and rarely do you get a clash once you've pulled out the fairly obvious mismatches. And again, the principles are the same in pairing sake and food as they are for pairing wine and food. In other words, you look at the sake and you look at the food, and you look for similarities between the sake and the food, be it flavors, aromas, texture, things like that, that make both the sake taste a little bit better and the food taste a little bit better, and it makes the whole experience better overall. Or you can look for contrasts. In other words, for example, a somewhat oily fish and a sake with a decent acidity to it. The contrast there can make both the fish and the sake taste better and the whole experience be better as well. So pairing sake and food is not rocket science. It's pretty much the principles are the same as they are for pairing wine and food. When you look at talking about pairing sake and food, there's countless theories out there. There's many, many, many theories. There's lots of people that say, this is the way that you need to pair sake and food, or this is the way that you have to do it. But really, there is no one universally agreed upon way. The point is, experiment. If it works for you, you're doing a good job in pairing your sake and your food. A bit more about, historically, in Japan, pairing sake and food wasn't quite the methodical or deliberate or premeditated process that it was with wine and food. But you can do extremely precise pairings with sake and food as well. Maybe they weren't doing really precise pairings 100 years ago, but you can. You can do extremely precise pairings if you want to do that. So it's got infinite potential for pairing with food. There are some things that you can do with wine that you can't really do with sake. For example, you really can't pair based on region. For example, the sake of Western Honshu tastes like this, so you pair it with this food. There's too many exceptions in every region of Japan, so that's really not something you can count on. Furthermore, rice, very often you can pair a wine based on the grape that was used in producing it. But you can't really do it that with sake, because although rice does have qualities that are conveyed in the final sake, 10 brewers can take the same rice, mill to the same degree, and make 10 completely different sake. So you really can't pair based on the variety of rice as well. It's also a little bit challenging to pair based on the grade. In other words, a Honjozo will pair with this kind of a food, a Daiginjo will pair with this kind of a food. That's not as dependable as a lot of people wish it would be. However, of these three options, in other words, region, rice, and grade, pairing by grade probably holds the most potential. What you really need to do is you need to taste the sake. Taste the sake and you'll know exactly what it tastes like, what its texture is, what the aromas are, and that will help you make good decisions pairing with food. Another thing you could look at is umami. I think more and more people in the world are familiar with the term umami. I like to call it a subtle richness. Some people call it a yumminess, a savoriness. There's various terms for it. But I think umami is a good tool you can use in pairing sake and food. In other words, you look at the relative level of umami in the sake and the relative level of umami in your food. And if you've got a really rich umami food, you'll want a rich umami sake to pair with it. This is another thing. It's kind of a simple thing that you can use to work with pairing sake and food. We'll be looking at some pairings later, and hopefully a couple of the principles that I touched on will come up as Andy and I pair some sake and food. But at the end of the day, it's not rocket science. Experiment and find out what works for you. And just remember, the principles are the same as they are when pairing wine and food. Next, briefly, I'd like to talk a bit about region. Does region matter? In other words, when I talk about regionality in sake, does the sake from Western Honshu have a particular style to it? And does the sake from the Tohoku region have a particular style to it? The answer to the question is yes. Regionality is a big part of sake. It's extremely enjoyable to study, and it is a big part of the sake world. However, it's not quite like wine. It doesn't work exactly the way that wine does. It's not clearly as delineated or clearly as expressed as regionality is in the wine world, but it's extremely an important part, still an extremely important part of enjoying sake. So what I want to talk about now, somewhat briefly, is regionality. What affects regionality in sake? What makes the sake of one particular part of Japan taste in a particular way, while the sake from another part of Japan will taste completely differently? So we'll talk about what affects regionality and what detracts from it. I also have to add that not all regions in Japan have a style to their sake. Every region of Japan makes at least some sake, and every region of Japan makes good sake. But not every region of Japan has a consistency of style running through all of the breweries in that area. But most do. I would say probably 60% of the regions do have some regionality to it. So let's talk about what contributes to regionality in the sake world. First of all, rice, obviously. Now, these days, you can ship rice all over the country. But historically, 100 years ago or 200 years ago, that wasn't practical. So brewers used the rice that was grown in their area. And because all the brewers in a particular area would use the same rice from that area, you tended to get a consistency of style that was contributed by the rice they were using. Another would be water. In those regions, like Hiroshima, where we are now, where you've got a consistent source of water or a consistent type of water throughout the region, that can definitely affect the style of sake that's made in that region. For example, when we talk about hard water and soft water, it's about mineral content, and they lead to completely different styles of sake. So rice and water are two things that will contribute to the regionality of a particular region of sake. Another would be climate. When you go up in the northern part of Japan, it's much colder, and that means they'll be fermenting at lower temperatures, and they'll also store the sake at lower temperatures as well. And that will give you a much cleaner, crisper sake. When you come down to the western part of Japan, like western Honshu, where the ambient temperatures are warmer, you'll ferment at a higher temperature, and you'll store at a higher temperature too, which will give you a much richer, fuller sake. So the climate has a lot to do with regionality as well. Cuisine. Hundreds of years ago, when people in the mountains drank sake, the food they had, they didn't have fresh fish on a daily basis up in the mountains. They were eating preserved, rich, salty food. And so the sake that developed in those regions came about to support the richer, salty, preserved food up there in the mountains. However, if you went down to the seaside, right, where there's fresh fish in abundance, and roads that could carry fresh vegetables and meat around, the food was much lighter. And so the sake that developed in the regions closer to the ocean and where they had roads, not in the mountains, was much lighter sake because of the cuisine that was enjoyed. And then another thing that affects regionality is toji. Toji are master brewers. The person in charge of any one brewery is known as the toji. And the toji styles and the toji guilds will dictate a lot about the way that a sake is brewed. So in any one given region, traditionally, historically, not as much anymore, but traditionally, historically, you had toji all from one guild in a particular region. And so the sake of that region all had something similar because of the guild of toji that were brewing that sake behind the scenes. So see, these are some of the things that contribute to regionality. Let's talk about what takes away from regionality, what detracts from it. One of those is the convergence of ginjo styles. Remember, ginjo's only been around for about 40 or 50 years. But ginjo tends to taste more like other ginjo, fruitier and lighter, than it does the original styles of the regions. So as ginjo gets more and more popular, we find more and more sake converging in terms of flavor profiles. So if I want to know if a sake conforms to the region from which it comes, I don't want to drink their ginjo. I want to drink their lower grades of sake to see how that matches up. So as ginjo becomes more popular, the styles kind of converge, and in my mind, that takes away from regionality a little bit. Another one is the modern market, the realities of the modern market and infrastructure. What I mean by that is, I live in Kamakura, half a country away, but I can order any sake online I want from any part of the country and have it delivered. What that means is, in the old days, breweries' main market was their local neighborhood, right? They made sake for the local people. It never really left the market. But these days, they might be making sake for the local people here in Hiroshima, but also in Osaka, Nagoya, Tokyo, maybe New York, maybe Paris. So all of a sudden, their market is much broader, and they have to brew sake that appeals to a much wider range of people than just their local neighborhoods. And this, I think, detracts from regionality as well. And another thing that detracts from regionality is there's no laws. There's no rules that says, okay, if you're in this part of the country, you must use this rice or brew in this particular way. So there's nothing to restrict the brewers in terms of brewing a regional sake. So these things detract from regionality. A couple more. Remember, rice can be shipped all over the country. There's certain parts of Japan, and Western Japan is one of them, where better sake rice grows in much more abundance in other parts of Japan. But you can ship sake rice all over the country. So a brewer in the northern part of Japan can buy rice grown in Western Japan. So the point is, you say, okay, this is my local sake, but the rice that I used to make this sake was grown several hundred kilometers away, right? That's kind of detracts from the concept of regionality a little bit. Also, changes in culinary lifestyle. People are no longer eating what they were eating 50 years ago. People in Japan today have a much wider range of food available to them. So the sake that they want to drink is a much wider range of sake as well. And I think this detracts from regionality a bit as well. Then there's technology. In the old days, if you were in a particular part of Japan, you had to brew your sake using the temperature, the climate of that region. These days, you can just put a refrigerator on your whole brewery, right? And you can ferment at any temperature you want if you choose to. So technology and climate control have actually had an adverse effect on regionality as well. Now, to make this as easy as possible, there's a general rule of thumb that I like to talk about when we're talking about regionality in sake. And it's very simple to remember, and it's not 100% accurate, but I didn't make this up either. A lot of people think this way too. Basically, the farther northeast you go in Japan, remember, it's going to get colder up there. The farther northeast you go, the more light, fine-grained, and delicate the sake is going to be. The farther west you go, the farther into the southwestern part of Japan, the more rich, earthy, and big-boned the sake is going to get. And again, this is a very, I think, easy to apply and relatively true rule. So again, if you look at this map in Japan, the farther northeast you go, up into the Tohoku region, the more light and delicate the sake is going to be, more fine-grained. I like the term fine-grained. Lots of flavor, just compacted in. The farther southwest you go, to where we are in Nishi, in western Honshu, the more rich and earthy and big-boned and heavy the sake is going to be. And I think this is a very good rule that you can remember. However, remember this too, like everything related to sake, there's many, many exceptions to this progression of northeast to southwest, fine-grained to big-boned. It's not a completely smooth progression. Along the way, there are regions and prefectures that make styles of sake that have nothing to do with the progression that I just outlined. Having said that, it still really is a very good rule in beginning to study regionality in the sake world. I'll come back to this point several times. If you want to learn about sake, the most important thing you can do is to taste a wide range of sake. Don't just stick with one type. Drink as many different types of sake as you can, as many different varieties of sake as you can, and that's definitely going to be the best way for you to learn about sake. With that point, I would like to wrap up part one. We'll take a 5-minute break. Be sure to get your sake and your food set out, and we'll come back in 5 minutes and pick up with the second half of the presentation and enjoy a bit of sake along with that. Thank you for listening for the first half.
So everybody, welcome back. Now I'm sure you have 5 sake and pairing food on your table. Now I'd like to introduce our another speaker today, Mr. Andrew Russell. He was born in Scotland in 1981. While studying at the University of Edinburgh, majored in Japanese culture, he studied abroad in Okayama University. During that time, he was awakened the wonder of Japanese sake. After graduating the university in 2017, he started working in a brewery, Juhachizakari Shuzo, in Okayama Prefecture. Now he works as a sake brewer at the Imada Shuzo in Higashi Hiroshima. Okay, now let's start the tasting. Mr. John Gardner and Mr. Andrew Russell, I'll hand it over to you two.
Welcome back, everyone. Welcome, Andy.
Thanks for having me, John.
So again, we will progress fairly quickly into the tasting, but let everybody know how this is going to unfold. I want to give a bit of an outline of the sake industry and who oversees it, which will give you a bit more of an idea of regionality. And then we will taste the first sake, and Andy and I will compare notes, and we'll taste the food and compare notes about that as well. And then we'll have a couple of other lively banter questions as we move through the sake in that way. So, starting right away, if you were to look at Japan, again, we want to talk about the sake of Western Honshu right now. And this is a map of Japan, obviously. And I didn't have the technical skill to draw a big circle around Honshu only, so I kind of put an X through everything that wasn't Honshu. So the island of Kyushu, the island of Shikoku, and the island of Hokkaido, they're lovely places, really, and they don't deserve an X, but those are not Honshu. Honshu is the main island that is not X'd out right there. And this is the Western Honshu area that we're talking about today. It actually consists of 5 prefectures. If you have a map in front of you, you might be able to locate those. The National Tax Administration is the government body that oversees the sake industry in Japan. And there's 47 prefectures in Japan. What they've done, the National Tax Administration, is divide Japan up into groups of 1 to 5 or 6 prefectures, and they have a regional tax bureau in each one of these offices, just to give you an idea of this. So each regional tax bureau is named for the city in which it is located. Today, we're talking about the sake of Region 8, which is in Western Honshu, and the office of which is Hiroshima. So they call it the Hiroshima Regional Tax Bureau. And the prefectures that are included in this under its jurisdiction are Okayama, Tottori, Shimane, Hiroshima, and Yamaguchi prefectures. The offices of these regional tax bureaus are very instrumental in doing many things with the sake breweries in their region, and they do a lot of guidance. They do a lot of they have a lot of influence over the style and the nature of the sake in each one of the regions over which they have jurisdiction. For example, they'll assist the brewers in many ways. They'll give them guidance and teaching, education, training, things like that. Lots of research and development, in particular into things like yeasts and new rice varieties. They'll do promotional events, very seriously, like this promotional event today, that will help promote the sake of their region. And furthermore, they regulate and enforce the laws that need to be regulated and enforced surrounding sake production and things like that. So all these will affect the quality and the nature of the region's sake. And again, the 5 prefectures that are in the jurisdiction of the Hiroshima office are the ones that are in the circle right there. So, with no further ado, I would like to move into tasting our first sake. Just to let you know, we have provided people with a wide range of food that you could buy to do the pairing. And we have a bit of food here as well. Now, I realize that those of you listening out there might not have the same food selection. In fact, the chances are that you don't. And you might have something completely different. You might not have any food at all. But just to show you what Andy and I will be pairing with, we'll be looking at 2 junmai ginjo first. And we'll be pairing it with lightly salted tomato and a fish called hokke, which is known as an atka mackerel, and that has been salted. So if everyone would please open your first sake and taste it. In the intention of full disclosure, I'll let you know that Andy and I have both tasted these before and taken copious notes. So we will taste them again now, but we actually have taken notes on this before. Right. So if I look at this particular sake, Chiyomusubi, to me, I get some light banana and maybe a little bit of apple, but mostly banana, and a lot of nuts in the aromas as well. To me, there is a sweetness, but it's a low-key sweetness. It's more like a marshmallow type of sweetness to it. It's a very broad flavor, and that's a recurring theme in the sake of Western Honshu. In other words, we're in the western part of Japan, so you're going to get broader, heavier flavor profiles, and I see that here too. It's soft, it's fairly deep, and there's a good amount of gaminess, almost a wildness to it. Very spicy, very layered, and I think that is a direct result of the rice that they're using, which is known as goriki rice. Andy, what did you think about this?
Yeah, the first thing I noticed was slightly firmer acidity than the other sake that we're going to try. I think it's probably been aged slightly as well, most likely in a tank for perhaps half a year, maybe even longer. It's not typically ginjo-esque aromas, the apple, type of aromas that you would usually associate with. Like you, I was more getting sort of nutty aromas, and yeah, definitely we both had that marshmallow kind of soft, rounded flavors. So yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about the brewery from your viewpoint? I'm sure everybody has heard several times that he's actually a brewer. He works at a local brewery making a sake called Fukucho. Can you tell us from your experience as a brewer a bit more about this brewery?
Yeah, so they're heavy proponents of the rice, the goriki rice, which is the representative of Tottori Prefecture. It seems to be quite a deep, full-bodied rice, so that the sake produced from it seems to be that way, which again would lend itself to a little bit of aging. But I believe Tottori is the least populated prefecture in all of Japan. And the brewery does emphasise the use of local rice, obviously local water as well. I think that's probably got a good influence on the sake that they're brewing. So, yeah.
A couple more things about Tottori Prefecture. I admit I had intended to say this before we tasted the sake, but currently there's 16 breweries that are actively brewing in Tottori Prefecture. Together with Shimane Prefecture, which we'll talk about next, it's known as the Sain region, which refers to the fact that they're on the western side of a mountain range. Traditionally, they were brewed by a guild of toji known as the Izumo Toji. The representative rice is goriki, one of the representative rice, and goriki is actually the rice that they used to make this sake. And to me, overall, it's somewhat earthy and rich sake overall. Next, we'd like to move into tasting the food. Again, Andy and I will be tasting some salted tomato and some salted hokke, akta mackerel fish.
Yeah. You start with the mackerel?
Yeah, might as well do that. And again, in the interest of full disclosure, we did this before too, so we're prepared to talk about this a bit more than we might have if we hadn't tasted it in advance. Andy, what did you think? I'll let you start.
Yeah, the first thing I thought was that it certainly suits the rice. That sort of slightly salted umami flavour. The sake is quite a full-bodied sake as well. So yeah, I think they kind of balanced each other quite well in that respect.
Now, I thought both the white flesh fish and the saltiness of it allowed the sake to be more expressive. I thought the sake was much more expressive because of that. And the texture of the rice seemed to come out thanks to the texture of the white flesh fish, I thought.
Yeah, there's something slightly spicy about the sake.
About the sake?
Yeah, which I think works well.
Excellent. So before moving on to the next sake, I just have a question for you. I know you studied in Okayama at Prefecture University for a while, and I know that you were very into sake. But brewing sake is not an easy job, and it could not have been a light decision. What on earth compelled you to start brewing sake?
Good question. Sometimes wonder myself. No, I think it's just my personality that when you become interested in something, I tend to become quite obsessed with it. And for me, it's just logical that the quickest way to learn about that thing is to get as close to it as possible. And there really is no quicker way to learn about sake than to actually brew it. So yeah, the decision was made one night when I was drinking. I finally plucked up the courage to go into a bar in Kyoto. I didn't really know much about sake, but I asked the barman if he had any recommendations, and he said, "Well, where are you from?" I thought that's a very strange question, but we'll go with it. And when I told him I was from the UK, he put a glass in front of me, and it was Tamagawa, made by my fellow countryman Philip Harper. And it was that moment I just remembered hearing his story and thought, why don't I just do this myself? And then I contacted you, actually, believe it or not.
I do remember.
So, but yeah, there's a few rejections. It's not particularly easy industry I would imagine, for some people to get into. But luckily, after a few rejections, I managed to go to a brewery that I'd already met the owner and what have you, and I knew the brand quite well. And that was it. I was a sake brewer. So.
Excellent. Interesting story.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the next sake. In order to do that, we're going to move into Shimane Prefecture. And again, if you look at the miniature map of Japan in the lower right-hand corner, you can see where Shimane is. It's right next to Tottori Prefecture. Currently, there are 30 sake breweries or so actively brewing sake in Shimane Prefecture. Together with Tottori, as we mentioned before, it's known as the Sanin Prefecture region. Traditionally, just like Tottori, it's brewed by Izumo Toji. The representative sake rice have actually got 3 here at the Kairyo Omachi, Kannomai, and Sakanishiki. Kannomai and Sakanishiki are fairly recently developed sake rices from the region. They haven't been around, but I don't know, 10, 15 years, I think. Like Tottori, it's somewhat earthy and rich, often with a bright acidity to it. Today's Shimane representative will be a sake called Gassan. Again, this is a Junmai Ginjo, and we will pour ourselves some Gassan and enjoy that in a second. Andy, I'll let you start with this one. Your comments on it.
Yeah, I mean, I know this brewery quite well. I'm quite familiar with it. I suppose the most distinguishable feature about it is they use extremely soft water, and you can really taste that in the sake. It's very juicy, but it's also very, very smooth and very, very well balanced. I think you can really kind of taste that it's been extremely well crafted. I've met the Toji before, and he talks a lot about koji production, and I think with such soft water that they're using, they obviously really need a strong koji to go with it. But yeah, it's a beautiful sake, and I suppose it's a very, very good representative of soft water brewing style.
Interesting. And you would know a lot about that these days, wouldn't you?
Yes, yeah, my current brewery is also not quite as soft water as they claim to have at Gassan, but it's very, very close. So,
my own comments on this particular sake was I found that the aromatics were mainly defined by apple, but with a good amount of juicy pear in there as well. Again, I saw weight, breadth, a nice acidity. In the center, in the core of the flavor, I saw a lot of ripe cherry and nuts. But at the end, there was this great astringency, this great acidity, astringency that tied everything together. I thought it was really enjoyable for that reason.
Yeah, I definitely got the apple-y and maybe more peach flavor and aroma as well. But yeah.
Agreed. Now that's all I can smell. Thanks.
Yeah. Sorry, I've put that word in there.
So we're gonna try that with something really simple, which is just a slice of salted tomato. And it's a very simple pairing, but I think this particular sake is very suited to it. To me, it's a very fleshy tomato, and I think the texture, again, of the vegetable allows the texture of the rice to come through. The salt allows a lot of the flavors to be expressed, and I think that combination, as simple as it is, makes this sake very enjoyable and it brings out the best of it. Andy, you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I put it, they're both very, very fresh tasting, so they both complemented each other very well. There's a little bit of acidity in the, and certainly umami as well, but they're kind of equally balanced in that respect. But yeah, definitely, it's a very refreshing sensation to pair them well together. So, yeah.
That was a nice pairing as well. Again, you could do many more complicated pairings than this, but we're just trying to get a simple thing going today, and I think that was a great pairing for sure. Before we move on to the next sake, this is your second season at Imada Shuzo, is that correct?
We've just started our second season.
You just started your second season there. Do you plan to stay there for a while, or are you just winging it? Or what's that all about? Forgive the brashness of my question.
Yeah, no, not at all. I hope so. It all depends on whether they want me to stay or not. But no, obviously, as a foreigner, moving to a different brewery was reasonably stressful. There's different terminology that they use and what have you. So I would like to stay where I am for the foreseeable future. And also working for a toji such as Imada-san, highly experienced, highly knowledgeable, highly motivated, and it's an interesting style of sake brewing to me as well. So it kind of ticks all the boxes. So
very interesting.
Yeah.
For those that don't know, he works at Imada Shuzo, and Miho Imada is both the president and the toji at that brewery. Both of those are very difficult jobs, and it's almost superhuman for someone to be both the president and the toji, but she does it, and that's who Andy works for. So, next, I'd like to move on to the next region and the next sake. We'll be moving, where was I? We'll be moving from Shimane into Okayama Prefecture, and I'll talk about the sake in a moment, but the food that we have to pair with it is some crab kamaboko, and some sardines in oil, and we'll be working with that. The sake that we're going to pair is sake shitosuji, bizen sake shitosuji. It's a honjozo from Okayama Prefecture. So everybody pour yourself a bit of this, and then I'll give you some comments on it in a minute. Jack, I think I'll so this is a honjozo, which means it's been made with rice milled to at least 70% of the original size, and they've used a bit of alcohol in producing it, a bit of added alcohol. To me, it's an outstanding representative it's a very typical standard, it's a very wonderful representative of the style of honjozo. Very smooth, dry for the most part, but to me there's a nice earthiness to it and a good umami to it as well. Rather than being fruity, it's a bit more herbal and a bit more floral, I think. I think it's got a buttery, dry touch to it and a sweet touch in the center. And that balance, that juxtaposition, putting those two things next to each other is very enjoyable. And it's made with a rice, well, actually, I forgot to do this. So before I go too much further, let's do this here. Okayama Prefecture has 44 sake breweries in it that are active. Traditionally, maybe not as much anymore, is brewed by a guild of toji known as the Bichu Toji. Typically pretty sweet and rich sake. And this is where I'm driving next. The representative rice is something called omachi. Omachi is the oldest, actually the oldest sake rice in existence right now. And it pretty much defines a lot of the sake from Okayama Prefecture. In particular, this brewery, Toshimori Shuzo, making bizen sake shitosuji, they use a whole lot of omachi rice. And to me, omachi gives a wonderful, wonderful herbal flavor to it. Tends to have slightly higher acidity and sweetness, but a very, very distinctive flavor. And that herbacity, that herbal touch, is coming through really, really clearly in this sake. So not only is it an outstanding representative of honjozo, it's also a great representative of omachi rice. Andy, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that when I tried this previously was it's a really strong feeling of nostalgia for me. As you said, my formative years in the sake industry were spent in Okayama Prefecture. It's got a sort of slight dryness to it. It's actually quite a light sake as well. I would describe this as a session sake, although we're pairing it with food. I think you could just drink that all night and it wouldn't get in the way of anything. I definitely got that slight butteriness as well, which is more than likely from the omachi. But just to touch on what you were saying about omachi, not only is it Okayama omachi, but it's also considered the best omachi as well. The brewery is located in Akaiwa. And Akaiwa Omachi has the highest reputation for omachi anywhere in Japan. So it's top quality rice, perhaps maybe the most popular sake rice, maybe.
I maybe might agree with you.
Yeah.
So we're pairing this with crab kamaboko and sardines in oil. And so we'll check that out right now. For those of you that don't have these in front of you, pair it with whatever you do have and see how well it works. Andy, you want to comment first on the food?
Yeah, well, we both mentioned the sort of slight buttery umami. As I say, it's quite light, and the crab also has a slight umami to it as well. So I thought, like I said, it's kind of a session sake, so it's not going to get in the way of any. But they paired very, very well together in that sense. Neither one overpowered the other one.
Right.
They just kind of worked in harmony. So
yeah, I think they're both fairly simple, right?
Yeah,
in other words, the kamaboko is a simple flavor profile. This is a somewhat subdued, smooth sake.
Yep.
And so I think the simplicity of the kamaboko helped a bit of the herbal nature of the omachi and the umami in that to come out a bit more. But they're both relatively simple, and I think that pairing, that thing that they share in common, made the pairing work out quite well.
Yeah, I think that with it being Honjozo, it does have that sort of light, slight crispness to it as well. So, which is why, as I said, it's a great sort of session sake. That it's not going to get in the way of many foods at all. So,
we also have some sardines. Did you try the sardines with this? And what did you think?
Yet.
While you're working on the sardines, I'll say one thing, folks. The selection number 5, if you have the list, which is grilled Brussels sprouts. I think that is just an outstanding pairing with sake. Grilled Brussels sprouts in olive oil and salt. And the bitterness of the Brussels sprouts really, to me, brings out a lot of depth in sake. I like bitter vegetables with sake myself. It might just be me, but we don't have that in front of us today. But I can highly recommend that with a lot of sake, and in particular with sake with the herbal touch that this particular sake has today. Go ahead.
Yeah, so obviously it's a slightly oily fish, and again going back to the Honjozo, it's just nicely, smoothly cuts into that oil. I think maybe slightly more higher alcohol content, it probably wouldn't be quite the pairing that it is. But,
very interesting.
So yeah, it's just a good balance between the two.
I liked the smokiness of the sardines seemed to tie in well with the sake, I thought. That
slightly butteriness to it.
Yeah, butteriness too as well. Okay, before we move on to the next sake, I would like to ask you another question or two. So you've worked at 2 breweries so far. Both of them are in this part of the country. Both of them are in Western Honshu.
Yes.
Can you tell me 1 or 2 differences? There's probably 1,000.
Yeah.
There are 1 or 2 differences between how sake is produced in each of these 2 breweries?
Yeah, if you look at the 2 on the surface, there's actually not too much to differentiate them. They're both reasonably small scale. They're both craft breweries, and they're both in actually they're both very, very close to the Seto Inland Sea, so they have that in common as well, and they're in neighbouring prefectures. However, going slightly deeper than that, and they're actually very, very different. Imada Shuzo is obviously we're famous for soft water brewing, and that tends to go hand in hand with ginjo production. Both breweries that I worked for made ginjo, but it was a very, very different style. The for example, I never used ice in brewing until I worked with Imada Shuzo. The mashing temperature, or the shikomi ondo, was a lot lower, or is a lot lower at Imada Shuzo than it is at Juhachi Zakari. And you can taste that in the final sake. There's a slightly more richness to the style I made before in Okayama. I suppose maybe some slight sweetness as well. Whereas Imada Shuzo is much cooler temperature, longer term fermentation. It tends to give you that slightly more refined, maybe it's wrong to say just ginjo, because we do make other brands as well, other styles as well, sorry. But that would be the main difference, is the temperature that we ferment at.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's move on to the next region and the next sake. To make sure I don't forget this time, we're going to talk about Hiroshima Prefecture, which is where we are right now. Currently, there's 49 sakegura, 49 breweries actually making sake here in Hiroshima Prefecture. Traditionally, it was brewed by a guild known as the Hiroshima Toji. They had their own guild here. Two representative sake rice might be Hatta Nishiki and Senbon Nishiki. There's others as well. Very important. Throughout most of Hiroshima Prefecture, you've got fairly soft water. And again, that's related to the mineral content. The exception is a narrow strip of land in the city of East Hiroshima, in the city of Higashi Hiroshima, called Saijo. And Saijo has comparatively harder water than the rest of the prefecture. So if you look at the sake of Hiroshima, typically it's sweeter sake, rich and sweet sake, again, except for Saijo. The brewers of Hiroshima and others as well say that ginjo methods were actually created here in Hiroshima. In order to brew ginjo, you need to ferment much more slowly, and the soft water dictates you'll have a more lackadaisical, slower fermentation. So the brewers had to do everything to adjust to their softer water, and the everything they did was exactly what you need to do to make ginjo. So ginjo methods were actually developed here in Hiroshima. Today's Hiroshima representative is something called Kamoizumi. It's a product called Zoka. Zoka is a regional name, and they use a rice, probably the most well-known sake rice, called Yamada Nishiki, that's grown here in Hiroshima in the Zoka region. So why don't we get ready and taste, oh, wait a minute, let me go back before I forget this. Andy and I will be pairing that with some roasted chashu pork. What's the other thing we got there? Oh yeah, some pasta.
It's the pasta, yeah.
Some pasta, pasta with bacon on top of it. And we'll talk about those in a couple of minutes. So everybody pour yourself a bit of kamoizumi, and we will check that out.
Should we start with the pork then? Or will we do the...
Yeah, that's whatever.
Yeah,
that's fine. Yeah, we can start with the pork. Let me make sure I'm not forgetting anything here. Where are we here?
That's a good pairing. That's a good pairing.
It is indeed.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say for me, the first thing that you notice is how mellow and rounded the sake is.
Yeah, it is very mellow and rounded.
Yeah, I would say again, this is not a young sake, I don't think. I think this is deliberately spent time maturing in a tank. One of the things that the brewery is known for is not using charcoal filtration. You can obviously see that in the beautiful golden, light golden colour. So yeah, that's one thing that you notice, and you get that kind of beautiful honeyed kind of taste to it. So yeah, that's an exceptional pairing as well.
It is, yeah, it is indeed. Yeah. To me, it was all about richness and umami in both the meat and in the sake. Both of them are fairly rich. It's a fairly rich sake with a good amount of umami, and the meat too is fairly. It's been stewed a long time, obviously. I mean, it does have a bit of salt to it, but even if you were to take that out, it would still have plenty of umami and richness, and that facet of the two things pairs extremely well, I think.
Yeah. I think if you warmed that sake as well, it would be equally as good as a pairing.
I would agree with that as well, yeah. Okay, let's move on to the next thing, pairing this sake with pasta. Again, we have a creamed-based pasta with some bacon on top of it.
Yeah, that's also a wonderful pairing.
It is a wonderful pairing. I've long been a proponent of good junmaishu with a slight richness to it, and pasta just like this. Cream-based pasta with crushed bacon bits on top of it. The umami, the creaminess, the richness of a pasta like this, both the pasta itself and the sauce, just make a great umami tie-up. And then you've got the saltiness of the bacon on there kind of as an accent, and that helps bring out more of the flavor, or accent more of the flavor of the sake. So I've always loved this pairing very much.
Yeah.
And it's showing its mettle right here.
Yeah, and I think there's a bonus of some Parmesan possibly in there as well, which is, goes without saying is a fantastic pairing with sake. But
You're big on sake and cheese?
Very big. I can't think of a better pairing than sake and cheese.
Is that right?
You know, obviously a lot of people would assume wine would be the best pairing, but you know, that lactic connection between the cheese and the sake. Yeah, I think they're a match made in heaven. So, but yeah, particularly sort of rounded, you know, mellowed sake. Maybe not so much with personally with younger sake, but sake that's just being allowed to mellow out for, you know, half a year, maybe a year or longer is the perfect cheese pairing. So,
excellent. Before we move on to the last sake, which is waiting to be tasted, one more question for you. What's your current role at Imada Shuzo? For example, at any sake brewery, usually you have one person in charge of steaming the rice, one person in charge of the koji, one person in charge of the yeast starters. What is your current role, or are you kind of a jack of all trades?
To a certain extent, more along the lines of a jack of all trades, maybe a master of none. But no, there are certain areas where I'm concentrated in. For example, Imada-san does the koji, sorry. And at my last brewery, I was heavily involved in that. At this brewery, not so much. There's times where I have to go in and help out, but it's not my main task. My main job is more along the lines of shibori, so the pressing part, which logistically and risk-wise is, you know, right up there as one of the you know, the high-risk jobs, because it's the final stage, and you know, you don't want something to go wrong at that stage. But also from this year, specifically helping out with the moto.
The moto, the yeast starter.
With the moto, yeah, with the yeast starter. So, and that was a big thing for me, because that's where you can really see the change in the microorganisms, and you really get a sense of how special the chemical reaction is that goes on with a fermenting tank. It really is a living thing, and you have to treat it that way, and you have to behave like it's a living thing. So it can be quite nerve-wracking to worry. You sit at home sometimes and worry about it. But luckily, I have fantastic seniors who are there as a fail-safe to stop me doing anything stupid. So, yeah.
Two important things to augment what Andy just said. As I mentioned earlier in my presentation in the first half, the koji is the most important step of the process. That will make or break your sake. It's the heart of the brewing process. And the toji, Ms. Miho Imada won't let anybody else touch it, I'm sure. She insists on doing that herself. And I'm sure it's because it's such a leveraged step. But on top of that, Annie's in charge of pressing the sake in the end. You can have a wonderful, wonderful fermentation, but if you don't press it properly, that all goes to waste. So he's got massive responsibility in that simple-sounding role as well.
There's nothing simple there.
Deceivingly in its terminology.
Deceivingly simple, yeah.
All right, let's move on to the last sake, and let's see what I need to do about. I'll come back to the food in a second. We're going to move into Yamaguchi Prefecture. And Yamaguchi Prefecture currently has 24 active sake breweries in it. It was traditionally brewed by a guild known as the Kumage Toji, and I think there's only a couple of them left. It was once a much larger brewing region, I don't know, 60, 70 years ago than it is today. It became an industrial region. There were lots of factories that were built there, and that's very stable work. That and a number of other reasons, you've seen the production in Yamaguchi Prefecture drop off from what it was, but again, it's still a very, very significant brewing region. in terms of a representative sake rice, one they've developed locally there is something called Saito no Shizuku, and it's a relatively recently developed rice. I would say what, not 10 years? Would you agree?
Yeah, it's certainly new on the scene, certainly, and sort of being pushed as the representative rice of Yamaguchi Prefecture.
And I think most brewers are actually adapting it and actually using it. Much of the sake here is solid and stout, in my opinion, but I still think you've got quite a range of styles coming out of Yamaguchi sake. Would you agree with that as well? Or?
Yeah, I would just like to say about the toji thing. It seems to be very difficult to put your finger on what the style is of Yamaguchi, and perhaps that has something to do with the fact there was actually two toji guilds at one point. I believe they're called the Otsu Toji.
Otsu?
Otsu Toji,
Otsu
and then
toji.
the Kumage Toji. Both in different parts of Japan. One was in the north, Yamaguchi, one was in the north, and the other one was in the south. And I believe the one in the south had a lot more outside influence. They were sending them to different places. So, it seems to be a very, very varied style. But just talking about the rice that we mentioned, I have to confess I hadn't heard of it really in any great detail until we started preparing for this. So I contacted my friend Jim Ryan, who's a bit of a somewhat of an expert on Yamaguchi sake, and he told me some very interesting things about it. It's quite similar to Gohyaku Mangoku, which is a very hard rice. And the harder rice, big grained, harder rice ones can be quite particularly challenging to polish and then work with because they break easily. And Saito no Shizuku is very, very similar in that respect. So I think the person that we consulted with said that most people tend not to go above 50% polishing ratio. And this sake is obviously gone to 40% polishing ratio. So it's testament to the craft of the brewers that were handling it, that they've made such a good job of making this sake with what must have been challenging raw materials. So
interesting, very cool. Thank you for that insight. So let's try Gokyo. Everybody pour yourself a bit of that. Wait a minute, I completely forgot to let you know what we're going to be enjoying with it. We're going to be enjoying two things with this. One of them is a tarako desu yo ne.
Meron to spicy
roe mixed with potato salad. Very simple. That's cool. It's kind of mundane, right? It's almost plebeian, and you can get it at pretty much any convenience store in Japan. And we'll be enjoying that as well as some melon, which is going to be an extremely interesting pairing. So everybody, pour yourself a bit of Gokyo and enjoy the flavors and aromas.
Definitely daiginjo.
So this thing, right, exactly. This is very, very quintessentially daiginjo, a very, very good representative of a standard daiginjo. Standard, typical, classical, that's what I want to say. A very good representative of a classical daiginjo flavor and aroma. To me, it's very light, it's very focused, it's very balanced, it's very delicate, and it's very aromatic, as would be expected of a daiginjo. But to me, the aromas are more traditional aromas rather than modern aromas. In other words, there's countless yeasts that you can use out there, but I see more melon and banana than I do, for example, apple or tropical fruit coming out of this. So to me, it's got much more of a classical rather than modern. Not that one's better than the other, but just that kind of a flavor, aromatic profile. It's quite regal. It's got a citrus touch suffusing all of that. It's light, but it's also quite flavorful. It's not too light at all. And again, I see a nice astringency coming in at the end. Andy, do you have any comments on that, beyond that?
Yeah, very sort of low acidity, very vibrant aromas this time. You can recognise it immediately as from the daiginjo category. I would say it's definitely melon flavours as opposed to apple and what have you. But there's also something quite dainty about it. I would have probably had this as an aperitif, if I was drinking it myself. Just something very, very light. Very, very refreshing to get you to get your palate started. So, I'm looking forward to the melon pairing specifically.
Let's check that out.
Yeah.
So now we're going to try it with some, what do we call that in English? Tarakoto. Spicy roe mixed with potato salad. We'll try that first. I'll jump on this one real quickly. To me,
Sure.
the creaminess and the spiciness of this roe mixed with the potato salad really is a good comparison or juxtaposition. Putting it next to the clean fruity kind of emphasizes the clean fruity flavors and aromas of this classical daiginjo. So I thought that was a good pairing because the food actually brings out better aspects of the sake.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page. I sort of said it's like a pendulum effect a little bit, if that makes sense. You know, the two flavors, neither are particularly strong, but they are still significant in that sense. So yeah, it was kind of like they were playing tag with each other.
Playing tag with each other. Very interesting. Next, let's look at the melon. And
this is probably going to be easier to eat than it looks. Very nice.
yeah, very nice indeed.
Yeah, amazing how a simple fruit and sake can
Yeah,
pair so well.
absolutely. You were talking earlier about how you thought because it was so dainty, it would be a nice aperitif. And I do agree with that. But to me, it would be a nice thing to wrap up a meal as well. Because you've got melon running through all of this. There's just a tie to that. And it's just nice, clean, and light. And a great way to wrap up a meal. But again, you don't have to have a meal. You could sit there with a bottle of gokyo and a melon and just enjoy it all night, I
The
think.
simple things in life.
The simple things in life are sometimes the best.
Yeah, already you can feel it's like a palate reset. So they're both extremely fruity. Obviously, it's like double melon, but it's a very, very refreshing kind of watery sensation from the melon. So yeah, I stand corrected. Maybe it is better for.
It's a great aperitif too. It really was. I did think so. So we've worked through the 5 sake and the 5 food. I hope everybody enjoyed them. One more thing before we wrap up, Andy, I'd like to ask you. In your work, I realize that you're just working on a couple of aspects of the brewing process, but are there any particular styles of sake that you personally are more interested than others, or that you personally enjoy making more than others?
Yes, I don't have much experience with it until very, very recently. But the style that really has caught my attention recently is Kimoto. I have to confess, when I first joined the industry, I didn't quite understand it, and it sounded like maybe a bit of nostalgia, that people want to go back to the old ways. But it is an incredibly fascinating process, and much more nuanced than simply, pole. When you see them mashing the pole, there's a variety of ways that you can do it. But the transformation that moto goes through, and the almost miraculous things that have to happen for a tank of Kimoto or Yamahai to happen, to me, that's kind of the pinnacle of brewing, if you can get an understanding of that. And I have nothing but respect for the people that make that, year in, year out, without making mistakes. So yeah, definitely going forward, I'd love to make more Kimoto. So in terms of the actual sake that it produces as well, it's probably one of my favorite styles right now.
Just very quickly, for those that haven't had a lot of experience with Kimoto, the Kimoto method and its cousin, a similar method called the Yamahai method, are methods of producing the yeast starter that use lactic bacteria rather than adding straight lactic acid. That's the technical aspects of it. The result is you get more of a fine-grained flavor profile to it, and there's a whole lot of chemical things, naturally occurring chemical things that have to take place in the Kimoto style. A very, very unique style. Do you guys make any right now?
We are, yes.
Cool, excellent.
But yeah,
you're not supposed to tell me that yet? Sorry.
It's kind of a secret, yeah. It's
Okay.
the first time we've done it, and it isn't a conventional style of Kimoto. So I hesitate slightly to go into too much detail.
No, that's fine.
I made Yamahai at my last brewery, or I certainly observed Yamahai being made, and it's also an incredibly complex way of doing the moto. There's a reason why Sokujo, is considered a modern version of those two. The risk factor is reduced significantly, but the two of them together are both very, very interesting. So and produce very, very different sake as well. So.
Yeah, they are quite different, aren't they?
Yeah.
So, folks, the time has come, unfortunately, to wrap up today's session. We hope that you have enjoyed this very sincerely. Whether or not you're actually here in Western Honshu, we hope that you were able to enjoy the session. And please keep the sake of Western Honshu on your list of favorites and drink it as much as you can. Andy, thanks very much for your presence here today. I really enjoyed it. Thanks everybody for participating today. We hope you enjoyed both the material and the sake if you were lucky enough to have enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
Mr. John Gardner and Mr. Andrew Russell, thank you very much for your wonderful lecture. Very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. So everybody please give it up for them. Thank you very much. ありがとうございました。And participants displayed on the monitor for you. Did you have a good time? Yeah? You liked it? Okay. Glad to hear that. We appreciate if you could share your comments on your social media
I think that was my friend Harold.
and spread the word about sake to all over the world. Once again, thank you very much for joining us today. See you next time and bye.